Welcome everyone to another edition of the Sheffield Machine Learning Seminar Series. We are very pleased to have here with us Professor Stefano Fusi from the Columbia University from New York. We also have Professor Eleni Vasilaki, who is the head of the machine learning group at the University of Sheffield. And I'm Aditya Gilra, a new lecturer also at the University of Sheffield. So I'll introduce Professor Fusi. He graduated in physics from Sapienza University of Rome, Italy. And then he got his PhD in physics from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Then after postdoc stints at the University of Bern in Switzerland and Brandeis University in the US, in 2005, he became an assistant professor at ETH Zurich. And from 2009 onwards, he has been at the Columbia University in New York City. Now he is, of course, professor of neuroscience at the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience there. So we are again very pleased to welcome Professor Fusi, Stefano, and he will be talking to us today.
Right. Thanks a lot, Aditya and Eleni, for the invitation. I'm actually surprised how much I like this kind of seminars. Yeah, I can hear some echo. Maybe I should. Okay, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. I'll probably lower the volume. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the geometry of abstraction in artificial and biological networks. And basically, more than 3/4 of my presentation will be about, explaining what we mean by geometry and, more importantly, what we mean by abstraction. And let me start immediately by thanking all the people who were involved in this project. So if you're interested, we have a bioRxiv paper. This is the reference. You can see it here. I assume you can see my pointer, my mouse. Okay. I'm going to talk about artificial neural networks, but also about real biological networks. In particular, I will talk about neural representations in monkeys. And that's an experiment that has been done in the laboratory of Daniel Salzman. And all the data I'm going to describe today was collected by Silvia Bernardi. And the theoretical framework was developed by Marcus Benna and Mattia Rigotti. But I want to mention also that we're working with many other groups. And what I'm going to show you today is something that we could see in many other data sets, and in particular across many different species. So, for instance, we could see it in humans, in rodents, and in other experiments on monkeys. So I will not have time even to go over the list and tell you, but these are all other exciting projects that we are working on. Okay, so let me start by introducing the problem that we intend to solve. So let's say that you live in this very boring world, which is the MNIST world. And actually, it's even more boring because we are considering only 4 digits. Okay, I guess you're all aware that these are handwritten digits, and there are many instances of 1s here on the first row, many instances of 2s, and 3 and 4. And if you live in this world and you want to perform any task, you want to take advantage of the regularities of this world. And in particular, what you might be able to realize is that if you look at the right features, then all the instances, all the samples that we have in the first row, they actually share something, and they probably can be grouped together. And this is useful because then it will allow you to generalize to new instances of these ones, these digits. Now, this is one possible grouping. So, you're basically going to group all of them together, and you can create a sort of an abstract representation of the ones. And again, it's useful for generalization. But what I'm going to talk today about is not this kind of abstraction process that is induced by the visual stimuli, but something more cognitive. So let's say, for instance, that you want to group together all the ones and threes, because these are odd numbers, they represent odd numbers. And I don't want to do that on the basis of the mathematical properties of these digits. I mean, these are just images, and I just want to group them together in a way that takes into account the fact that all these numbers are odd. And analogously, I can group together all the even numbers. So I'm going to describe the process that leads to this grouping only later. But for now, I want to discuss what kind of neural representations you can have of this variable, parity, which essentially says whether one of these handwritten digits is odd or even. Okay, so I'm going to work a lot in this firing rate space. I guess most of you are familiar with these representations. So along each coordinate axis, I have the firing rate of a different neuron. So this would be neuron 1, neuron 2, and then this one would be neuron 3. Now, let's say that I record the activity when I present one of these digits. Okay, so for instance, it could be a digit 1, one of the instances. Then I'm going to have 3 values for the firing rates of the 3 neurons, and that would correspond to a point in this firing rate space. So let's say, for instance, it would be here. Okay, so this one instance. I can do the same experiment and with the different digits. So again, I live in this MNIST world, and all I have is essentially 4 classes of digits. And then I'm going to get here, essentially 4 clouds. Here I'm showing only the centroids of these clouds, but there will be 1 cloud for 1s, 1 cloud for 2s, 3s, and 4s. And now the first representation that I'm going to consider is one in which these centroids are actually at random locations in the firing rate space. So typically, when they're at random locations, what they're going to define is a 3D object. And in this particular case, you see this distorted tetrahedron is essentially the object that you get. Now, the important feature of this object is that it basically has the maximal dimensionality that 4 points would allow. And thanks to this, you have a lot of nice properties. So for instance, you can certainly represent parity in the sense that with a linear decoder, you would be able to separate all the instances corresponding to 1 and 3, which are the odd digits, from the instances of 2 and 4, which are the even digits. Okay? So for instance, here I'm drawing an hyperplane that separates the 2 blue points that correspond to the even digits from the 2 red points that correspond to the red digits. And the fact that I can separate them with a plane means that the linear decoder can do it. Okay, so this is great, and that means that parity is certainly encoded, but it's not really a special variable in this case. The points are at random locations, so there is nothing grouping together 1 and 3 and then 2 and 4. And for instance, if I want to separate, let's say, 1 and 2s from 3 and 4, I can do that. I don't know if it's clear from this plot, but also this hyperplane will do the job that I just described. So basically, in this situation, actually, you can separate the points in any way you like because you have the maximal dimensionality. Okay? So this would correspond to a different dichotomy, a different way of grouping the points together. What I'm showing here with this yellow hyperplane, it's separating the small digits, 1 and 2, from the large digits, 3 and 4. Okay? Now, I can do this for all possible groupings or all possible dichotomies. And in particular, I'm going to consider all possible balanced dichotomies. So for instance, if I group together 1 and 3, and then 2 and 4, that would correspond to a variable that is parity. It's whether the digit is odd or even. 1 and 2, 3 and 4 is magnitude. There are other ways that don't really have a name, but I'm going to essentially list all of them and see whether a linear decoder can separate these groups of points. And this is one feature of the geometry of the representation. And what I mean here by geometry is just the arrangement of all these points in the firing rate space. And it's related to the shattering dimensionality, which is a quantity that we introduced in our paper in 2013 when we were studying the dimensionality of the neural representations in prefrontal cortex using R. Miller's data from MIT. So essentially, this shattering dimensionality is the average decoding accuracy for a linear decoder across all these different dichotomies. So you prepare a list of all possible dichotomies, you train your decoder on a subset of instances, and then you test it on the held out instances, and then you look at the performance. And thanks to this arrangement of points and the fact that we have the maximal dimensionality, also the shattering dimensionality is maximal. So here it's normalized in a way that when it's 1, it means that you can separate the points according to all possible dichotomies. Okay, so there is here nothing special about parity. It's like any other dichotomy. All dichotomies are equally decodable in this particular case. So certainly we cannot say that parity is represented in an abstract format. In order to be represented in an abstract format, we need to require a little more. So it is represented, it is decodable, but it's certainly not in an abstract format. Again, the points are a random location, so there's nothing that is telling us that 1 and 3 should stay together and 2 and 4 should stay together. So if I look at the definition of abstract on the Merriam-Webster, the first definition is disassociated from any specific instance. So, I can try to build a representation based on this definition. And an obvious one is one where you literally pull together all the points that correspond to one particular class. So, for instance, all the odd points would be here in this cluster, and all the even points would be there in the second cluster, in the blue cluster. Okay, so, now parity is special here, and I'm going to tell you in a second what is the property that is really fundamental, and it's the defining characteristic of abstraction according to us. But first, let me tell you about the bad news. Okay, so you can certainly decode parity. That's the hyperplane that would separate the points corresponding to the odd digits from the points corresponding to the even digits. But that's pretty much the only dichotomy that you can decode. So the shattering dimensionality is actually very low. It's very close to chance. Okay. On the other hand, and now these are the good news, you can have some form of generalization that is much stricter than the traditional one, where you basically use all the points to train your decoder, and then you use some held out samples to test it. In this case, what you can do is, for instance, train a decoder on a subset of digits. So, for instance, only the small ones, 1 and 2. And then you are going to get an hyperplane if you're using this linear decoder. It's going to be different from the yellow one on the left. But the nice thing of this arrangement of points is that this decoder is going to generalize right away also to these other digits. Okay, so these other digits are completely different in terms of the sensory representation, but you will be able to cross-generalize to these other digits if you have this arrangement of points. And again, I didn't tell you how to get it, but let's assume that you group the points in this way. Okay, it's not too surprising. Okay, here I'm essentially discarding all the information about the irrelevant dimensions. However, this is an interesting property, and I'm going to call it cross-condition generalization. It's really the defining characteristic of a process of abstraction. And what I will show you is that this is not the only geometry that allows for cross-condition generalization. So this is an extreme, certainly legitimate form of abstract representation, but there are also others that would enable you to have this cross-condition generalization property. Okay, so let me stress that this cross-condition generalization property is something that you don't have in the random case. So again, this is the random case. This is the tetrahedron. You can separate the odd digits from the even digits. But let's say now you play the same game and you train a decoder on a subset of digits, so 1 and 2, for instance. Then you're going to get this purple hyperplane. In this case, it's just a plane because we have 3 dimensions. And points corresponding to 3 and 4 have really no reason to be on the right side of this hyperplane because they are a random location. So in this case, the cross-condition generalization performance is exactly a chance. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind. It's not that the points are more separated; they really need to have a very special arrangement to allow you to have this kind of cross-condition generalization. Okay, so this is to summarize. I first introduced this representation of parity, where parity is certainly encoded. You can decode it with a linear decoder. You have the maximal dimensionality and the maximal shattering dimensionality. The cross-condition generalization is actually a chance in this case. Then we have this other extreme case. This is 1D. It's the lowest dimensionality that you can have to encode anything. And in this case, the shattering dimensionality is very low, but the cross-condition generalization performance is maximal, at least for the variable parity, which is really special in this case. Okay, so you have this very high dimensional space. Here we have 3D, but in principle, you can have hundreds of dimensions. So we can probably do better than what we did in these 2 cases. So there are these other representations that are actually very interesting because they allow you to encode multiple variables in an abstract format. So for instance, let's say that you're considering here F1, and it's a neuron that cares only about magnitude. So, it can only separate essentially 1, 2 from 3, 4 in our simple case of the MNIST word. And this other neuron on the vertical axis cares only about parity. If you have this kind of factorized representations, then the points will be at the vertices of a square. And you see that now the manifolds corresponding to odd and even digits are relatively low dimensional, so there are 2 lines, and they're parallel. So the nice thing of this arrangement is that it allows you to do cross-condition generalization. So for instance, let's say you train your decoder on a subset of digits to decode parity, so 1 and 2. You get this hyperplane, and that would generalize right away in 3 and 4. Okay? Now, the nice thing with this arrangement is that you can play the same game with magnitude. So magnitude is also in an abstract format. You can train it on 1 and 3 to decode magnitude. So you get this purple hyperplane, and that would generalize right away to 2 and 4. Okay, so these are representations that now are becoming very popular in the machine learning community. There is a lot of work that has been done at DeepMind, in particular by Irina Higgins, with beta variational autoencoders. I'm not going to explain what they are, but if you're familiar with them, so then you can easily find the reference. And these representations are called disentangled. And, you can play a lot of interesting games. So, for instance, you can have another boring word, a little less than the MNIST word that I described at the beginning, where you have only chairs of all different types and sizes, and they're viewed from different angles. And then you pass them through this kind of variational autoencoders, or even beta variational autoencoders, which are those that have been studied by Higgins. And then you can actually find units that have exactly these properties that I was describing, that correspond to some factors, and they describe some interesting latent space. So for instance, here, you see there will be a unit, let's say the one here I'm indicating on the x-axis, that if you change, it would actually change the azimuth of the chair. So as I change the value of F1, then I start from this chair, and then it would essentially rotate. Yeah? And another one, for instance, would be for the leg style. So here you go from this leg style to another leg style. So when you have this kind of factorized representations, again, you can do this cross-condition generalization. So for instance, you can train a decoder to say whether you have this leg style here at the top or this leg style at the bottom. You get this hyperplane in this simple example. Of course, here I discretized everything just to visualize what happens. And then when you rotate the chairs, your decoder or your classifier would work right away. Okay, so these are very useful representations to generalize. Okay, so now these kind of neurons that are highly specialized, that they basically encode only one variable, are very rarely observed in the real brain. Okay, we actually think that if we see them, it's only by chance that some of them are a little more specialized than others. Most of the neurons actually respond to a combination of features, and typically it's actually a nonlinear combination. So this is a problem, because if we try to find this kind of factorized representation in the brain, we know that we're going to fail. However, there is a very simple transformation here that would make these representations more compatible with what we see in the real brain, which is a rotation. Okay, so if I rotate these representations, then every neuron is going to respond to a linear combination of these variables. And I still preserve all the nice generalization properties. In particular, if I do the cross-condition generalization, it still works also in this case. Okay, so this is probably some kind of representation that we might have in the brain if we are looking for this kind of abstract representations. Okay, so now the bad news. The bad news is that if you take this seriously and you really have a perfectly factorized representation, and I'm not saying it's what you get, for instance, in the simulations of with variational autoencoders, but let's say for a second that you get this representation, then there are a lot of dichotomies that you will not be able to decode with a linear decoder. Okay, so in this particular case, with only 4 points, there are only 2 that correspond essentially to what classically is known as the exclusive OR problem. So basically, if you want to separate the extreme values from the mid-range values, you will not be able to do that. Okay, there is no hyperplane separating these 2 groups of points. So, this probably not a big deal in the case of 4 points, but as you increase the number of points, the vast majority of dichotomies will not be decodable by linear decoder. Okay? So this is the one bad aspect of these representations. However, it's interesting that you can actually introduce a 4th type of representation. Okay, so this is just to summarize that these kind of representations here have a relatively high shattering dimensionality, but only because we have only 4 points. As you increase the number of points, the shattering dimensionality goes to chance. And we have a high cross-condition generalization performance for both parity and magnitude, so 2 abstract variables. Okay, so now what you can do is to start from these perfectly factorized representations and distort them. So you introduce some perturbations here. And the nice thing is that now you're going to make the representation higher dimensional. And you still preserve the ability to do cross-condition generalization, but at the same time, you can also separate some of the dichotomies that you would not be able to separate if you had this perfectly factorized representation. Now, if you run simulations, so you start from this kind of representations, and then you progressively increase the distortion. So that's what we have on the x-axis, the displacement magnitude. And then you measure the cross-condition generalization performance. It starts very high, because in the case of 0 displacement, you have this perfectly factorized representation. It stays up a little bit, and then it goes down, as you would expect. Now, the interesting thing is that when you look at the shattering dimensionality, of course, it starts low, and then as you increase this random displacement, it goes up because you get a maximal dimensionality representation. But there is a region here where you have a really good compromise where the cross-condition generalization and the shattering dimensionality are both relatively high. Okay, so you can actually find these nice compromises, and in this case, you would have the best of all possible worlds. And what I'm going to show you is that actually this kind of representations is what we see in the experiments. So are you going to have all the questions at the end, or?
Yes, Stefano, if as of now nothing has come up, so in the end.
Okay. All right, so let me now go to the real brain, to the biological brain. Okay, so first I will describe the experiment that they performed in Daniel Salzman's lab, and then I'll show you what they did in terms of recordings and the analysis of the geometry of the representations. So monkeys start a trial by holding a bar, and then a visual stimulus is presented. So it's a fractal, it's totally meaningless. And the monkey has to learn that in response to this particular fractal, it has to release the bar. And if it does so, it gets a reward. And there were 4 possible visual stimuli corresponding to 4 different fractals. I called them here A, B, C, and D. And the monkey had to learn that in response to 2 of them, A and C in this case, it has to release the bar. And to the other 2, it has to keep holding. And if it does the right thing, in the first 2 cases, the monkey gets a liquid reward. And in the second 2 cases, it doesn't get anything, but it avoids a timeout, which is something that they don't like. So, they're motivated anyway to perform the task in the correct way. Okay, so this is a relatively simple task, but now the interesting thing, and that's where the cognitive component comes in, is that without any warning, at some point they will switch to a different task set. So same stimuli, but now the visual motor associations are different, and also the outcome is different. So the monkey then has to learn this, and then these 2 task sets, they basically define 2 different contexts. Now, the interesting thing is that they kept switching between these 2 contexts, context 1 and context 2, so that the monkey is actually overtrained and it really understands the game, that there are only 2 possible words, context 1 and context 2, to the point that a monkey can actually do some inference. So here, essentially, I'm grouping together these triplets of stimulus, motor response, and outcome. And if I look at one of these triplets, that doesn't contain any information that says this is a triplet of context 1 or this is a triplet of context 2. These different triplets are grouped together by the temporal statistics. So basically, in context 1, this triplet is very often followed by these other 3, and only rarely by those in context 2. Okay, so these arrows represent the transition probabilities, and that's essentially defining the 2 different contexts. Okay, so this requires some process of abstraction. And we were wondering then if the representation of context is actually in one of these abstract formats that we described in the previous example. Okay, so I was saying that a monkey can do some inference. So it's illustrated here. So let's say you're in context 2 up to this vertical line. And now, all of a sudden, we switch to context 1. And the monkey doesn't know that. It cannot know that because there is no contextual cue. So the monkey has to figure out by trial and error. So when you present B, the monkey is going to make a mistake because it's going to respond accordingly to context 2. But after this first mistake, the very first time you present now A, the monkey can respond correctly, and it actually does so. Okay? So you can look at the actual data in the paper, but this is the kind of inference they can do. And that reassured us that the monkeys are not relearning the associations. They're really using some knowledge about context that goes beyond what you have in the individual trials. Okay, so the first thing we were wondering is whether there is any information at all about context. So we tried to decode context using a linear decoder. And again, the fact that you can decode it doesn't mean much at this stage, but at least it tells you that we are in the right brain area, that there is something interesting there and we can continue with the analysis. So this is the decoding accuracy as a function of time. This is during the presentation of the stimulus here, this bar. And it's in 3 brain areas. They actually recorded from 5 brain areas. It's really fantastic to work with them. But I'm going to show you only the data from these 3 brain areas. This is the first analysis that we performed. So the brain areas are the hippocampus, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and ACC. Okay, and they correspond to different colors. This is the number of neurons they recorded from. So you have a very high dimensional space where you can do this analysis. Okay, so now you see that the decoding accuracy is pretty close to 100%. So the information is certainly there. It's very strongly encoded. It's a little weaker in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but it's only because we have less neurons there. So the information is there. But the next and most important step is what is the geometry of these representations? And I really believe we need to go beyond simple decoding. Because in these brain areas, it's so unlikely that a variable is not encoded that you should write a paper only when you find out a variable is not encoded, not when it is encoded. Okay, so now let's look at the actual representation. So, we started from this 700-dimensional space in the hippocampus, and then we used multidimensional scaling to reduce the dimensionality. And here you see all these points correspond to different conditions. This is the time interval preceding the stimulus. Okay? So these are conditions of the previous trial. So this is when stimulus A was presented, B, C, and D. H and R are the 2 motor responses, hold and release. Plus and minus indicate whether the monkey received the reward or not. And the yellow circles indicate all the cases in which the monkey actually received the reward. Okay, so you see some clustering here, there's no doubt. Okay, so the group of conditions corresponding to context 1 in red, and this is a group of conditions corresponding to context 2. But there is a lot more than that. If I rotate it, you can see, first of all, that you basically have 2 relatively low dimensional manifolds that correspond to the 2 contexts. In this case, these are almost 2 planes that are kind of parallel. And the second thing is, look at the arrangement of the points. In particular, the yellow ones are all nicely arranged on the same side. Okay, so I have to say that the whole story started when we look at these plots and we said, yeah, well, this is clearly some indication that there is more than simple clustering. Okay, let's look at dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is interesting because if you care only about clustering, then you would draw the conclusion that context here is not in an abstract format. Because these distances, for instance, this one here, you see at the top, is larger than the distance between the 2 clusters. However, again, you have a very interesting geometry. You have these 2 almost parallel planes, and again, look at the arrangement of the yellow points. And analogously in ACC. So this is again very similar. Okay, and this is even more clustered than dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's a little more similar to what we saw in the hippocampus. Okay, so these are MDS plots. They shouldn't be taken too seriously. We went from hundreds of dimensions to 3, so we threw away a lot of important information. But we did the analysis in the original space, high-dimensional space, and in particular, we computed the cross-condition generalization performance. Okay, so that's not only a defining characteristic; it's actually a measure that you can use to characterize the geometry. So in our case, we had these 8 different conditions. So the top 4 correspond to context 1, the bottom 4 correspond to context 2. Now, you can divide these conditions in any way you like. So, for instance, this dichotomy, this way of dividing the 8 conditions into 2 groups correspond to the variable context. Okay? But you can divide the conditions in any way you like. So for instance, you can group together all the conditions that correspond to value. For instance, all the cases in which the monkey got a reward, and all the cases in which the monkey didn't get a reward. Okay? So this would correspond to a different variable. And you can do it also for variables that don't make much sense. Okay, so for instance, A and B together, there's no reason to do that, but it's another dichotomy. And that would correspond to another variable that doesn't have a name. But my point is that you can do this analysis in a totally unbiased way. You don't have to assume that you know what variables could be in an abstract format. You can actually go over all possible variables in this case, at least those that correspond to balanced dichotomies, and play always the same game, compute this cross-condition generalization, train on a subset of conditions, and test on the held-out conditions. Okay, so that's what we did, and we did it for 2 time intervals. The first one is the one preceding the stimulus. So all the variables I'll be talking about here, they refer to the previous trial. Okay, so here, now I'm showing the results in the 3 brain areas, hippocampus, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and in ACC. And I have 2 sets of points. So the empty circles correspond to the decoding accuracy for each of the 35 possible dichotomies, and the filled circles correspond to the cross-condition generalization performance. So the first thing that you see, now I'm going to tell you more about all these different dichotomies, but the first thing that you see is that the decoding accuracy is pretty high for basically almost all dichotomies. So if you compute the shattering dimensionality, it's really high in all the 3 brain areas. Okay? Now, the second thing that you see is that there are very few dichotomies that are actually in an abstract format that are different from chance. So these black bars, they correspond to the chance level, which would be essentially a situation in which you place all the centroids at random locations. So you can still decode the variable, but it's not in an abstract format any longer. So you see context is in an abstract format in all the 3 brain areas. It's a little weaker in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and in ACC, but only for a reason that I'm going to explain in a second. So you have other dichotomies that are in an abstract format. One is value, and it's not too surprising. It's something so important for the monkey that was probably in an abstract format from the very beginning. And the third one is action. So you see that action is in an abstract format in prefrontal cortex, but not in the hippocampus, despite the fact that we can decode it. It's a little weaker, but we can certainly decode it. But it's not in an abstract format. Okay? Now, let's look at the second time interval, and then I'll make some more considerations. So now we are presenting the stimulus, and this is just the classical decoding accuracy for value as a function of time, and we are focusing only on the interval during which the stimulus is presented. Okay? So you start from chance level, and then you go up very rapidly. It's a little faster in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and in ACC, and then you can decode the expected value. So it's the value that the monkey will receive in a couple of seconds in the hippocampus. Analogously, you can try to decode the second decision of the monkey, which is about the action. It's interesting that the monkey first represents in these brain areas, at least according to this decoding analysis, the value and then the action that is going to perform to get this value. But value is very prominent, and so it's not too surprising. And in this case, again, you see that it goes up very rapidly, and again, prefrontal cortex is a little earlier than the hippocampus. So now what we are going to do is to analyze the interval in which the variables of the current trial are already encoded, and in particular value, action, and context when they are already encoded. Okay. So we go now to this other interval that we identified using this decoding analysis. And now you see the signals are much stronger in this case because the firing rates are higher. And in particular, one of the things that you see is that, first of all, the decoding accuracy is really high. I'm going to give you the numbers of the shattering dimensionality. But context is in an abstract format in the hippocampus, and it's really at the edge for ACC. But it's certainly not in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. However, the decoding accuracy is around 0.9. So it's very strongly encoded, but it's certainly not in an abstract format. This is probably due to the fact that in the brain area where you actually make the decision, you need to mix non-linearly context with the stimulus identity. So somehow you need at least temporarily to move a little closer to a situation of higher dimensionality. But this is just a speculation because we cannot really analyze the time interval in which the decision is made because it's just too short. Okay, value and action of the current trial are in an abstract format, very strongly represented in all the three brain areas. Okay, but you clearly see that with this analysis you can identify dichotomies that otherwise would be exactly equivalent in the case in which you just try to decode these variables. Okay, so the shattering dimensionality here is really close to 0.9, so it's very high, which means that you can decode any variable you want. And again, it's not too surprising that you can decode so many different things in these high cognitive areas like prefrontal cortex and also the hippocampus. Okay, so now I want to show you also something about artificial neural networks. And I want to show you that it's actually surprisingly simple to get these kind of representations. It's almost embarrassing because you get them for free, even in the case in which you use some kind of vanilla backpropagation. Okay, so let's go back to our MNIST world. Now we have 8 conditions as in the experiment, so 8 digits in this case. And what we're going to do is to train a network to discriminate between odd and even digits. Okay? So we have a very simple input, 768 inputs. Again, it's a classical MNIST. And then 2 hidden layers. Okay, we actually can do it with 1, but in this case, it was interesting to see what happens in the 2 different layers. And then we have 2 output units, one for even and one for odd. Now, the interesting thing of these representations, the representations that we observed in the brain, is that we could see evidence that multiple variables are represented in an abstract format. So we wanted to do something similar here. So what we did was to make the output more complex and force the network to report not only whether a digit is odd or even, but also whether it's small or large. Okay, so we have all these 4 different outputs. They essentially encode these 2 different dichotomies, parity and magnitude. Okay, so now we focus on the representation of the second layer. And again, we are using just very simple backpropagation here. And you see, if you do the MDS plots, now you have a lot of digits. I'm showing only part of them. But you see that you clearly have the kind of geometry that you would expect, where you have 4 clouds at the vertices of a square. And you can see that along one direction, parity is going to be encoded. And along the other direction, it's actually magnitude. Okay, so this is the same representation. I'm just coloring the digits in a different way according to the 2 different dichotomies. Okay, so now you can do the analysis in the original high dimensional space, and you can compute the decoding accuracy for all possible dichotomies. And you see they're all basically the same. And all very high. So the shattering dimensionality is very high also in this case, which means that if you use these representations, you can actually decode any variable you like that corresponds to any grouping of these 8 different digits. So this also means that these abstract representations are not needed to perform the task, because these representations that you obtained when you train the network in this particular way could be used to perform any other task that corresponds to a different dichotomy. However, if you look at the geometry, now you see, and this is really a test of our technique somehow, you see that there are only two dichotomies that are significant and are very different from the others. And you see there's a big gap between the cross-condition generalization performance of this dichotomy and the next one here. And the top one corresponds to parity, and the second one corresponds to magnitude. Okay, so it's a nice method to identify what essentially the network is doing without knowing anything at all about the behavior. Okay, we're just looking at the geometry here, and I literally did it in this way. I did the simulations myself, and then I passed them to Marcus, and I asked him, tell me what are the dichotomies. I didn't use parity and magnitude because these were obvious, but this analysis is really totally unbiased, and it can tell you a lot about what the network is doing without knowing what actually the network is doing. Because I passed to Marcus only the representations in the hidden layers and nothing about the behavior. Okay, so now you might complain about this example because it's really so simple, and we have an explicit representation of the abstract variables in the output layer. Now you can play other games and see that you can actually get this kind of representations in many different ways. So this other game I want to play here is to actually simulate the actual task of the monkey that the monkey is performing. Okay, so again, I'm using a simplified network. So I have only two layers, but we have a version of the network that is actually recurrent. Chris Cueva is working on that. But here in this case, I'm just putting the current stimulus, and I need to put some information about the previous trial. Otherwise, the network cannot even learn the context. Okay, but that's it. That's all I'm passing to the network, and I'm training it to output the correct action and the correct value. In this case, it's supervised learning, but I'll show you what happens also in the case of reinforcement learning. Okay, so, we had to run this multiple times. Every point here corresponds to a different network. But you see that in the end, the geometry we get in the last layer is very similar to what we observed in the experiments. And the cross-condition generalization performance is pretty high, certainly for context. It's a little lower for value, but you see there are a lot of networks here at the top that have a cross-condition generalization performance. It's around 0.9, and action is also very high. And these are the only three dichotomies that are in an abstract format. Now, the interesting case of this, the interesting aspect of this exercise is that context is never explicitly represented. It's neither in the input nor in the output, okay? But the network is essentially using the temporal statistics of the inputs to build this representation of this latent variable context. Okay, now I told you that we did also reinforcement learning, and again, this is one interesting case where there is a latent variable that you have to discover. So what we did was to take inspiration from this famous paper. It's the Atari game paper from DeepMind, where they developed these techniques, deep Q learning. And it's a beautiful technique because you really don't need to know the latent variables or the states in the reinforcement learning algorithm. And so, it's a bit an overkill in our case, but we use the same strategy because it's a very simple principle. So we have a network and it's trained to output the Q values. So exactly the same as in the Atari game. And then we can look at the representation. So now this is reinforcement learning. So there is a lot of variability. It takes a lot of time to run these simulations. And I had to mention that in this case, we could not get the geometry of the observed representations unless we introduced here another term in the loss that would correspond essentially to the reconstruction of the input. So it's like an autoencoder. So we had the network performing the task using deep Q learning, but we had to encourage it to represent also the input using this autoencoder approach. If we do that, then again, we get in many cases representations that are very similar to those that we observed in the experiments. Okay, so let me conclude. So context is represented in all these experiments. It is abstract in all the recorded brain areas. And it's not the only variable. And we have this unbiased method to discover all the variables that are in an abstract format. So there are multiple abstract variables that are represented in all areas. Now, context is represented in an abstract format in prefrontal cortex, but the cross-condition generalization performance is a little lower. And that's probably because there are more variables that are represented in an abstract format. So it's more difficult then to get a high value of the cross-condition generalization performance. But that's certainly represented in an abstract format. And if you look at the right subspace, then you can generalize very nicely. So that's probably one of the main differences between prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, that in prefrontal cortex, the representations are contaminated probably by a memory component, working memory that comes from the previous trial. Similar abstract representations can be observed in simulations. Now we are running much more extensive simulations. We are discovering a lot of interesting things, but I gave you the main idea. And, you know, I just want to stress again that it's extremely important now to first of all, move away from single units, single neurons. When you analyze the data, it's all the interesting things are happening at the population level. But second, it's not enough just to say this variable is encoded in this particular variable, in this particular area, because I can decode it using a linear decoder or whatever decoder you want. You really need to look at the geometry of the representations if you want to learn more about for instance, differences between all the different brain areas. Okay, so I think I will stop here. I have a slide that reminds you about this paper, and with a beautiful depiction of the process of abstraction by Pablo Picasso. He was using this to train his students, and it would start from this very high dimensional representation of a bull, and as you move along this direction, you see a progressively more stylized low dimensional representation of the same animal. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Stefano. Wonderful talk with a great breadth covering lots of different fields. And I'm also still trying to process all of it. In the meanwhile, we do have some questions. Maybe I'll just invite. So there are 4, and the most voted one, let me just invite on screen. And if Sylvia, if you want to come online, just ask your question. If not, we'll ask it for you. I've just invited Sylvia. Okay, so it allows only 4 streams to come, so somehow. Okay, so maybe I can ask this question, and maybe Stefano, you can also read it. How general is the geometry you found across animals? And do you know whether it changes during learning? Or is there an inner bias towards a certain geometry? Yes.
Yeah, these are all good questions. So we're still studying the learning process. Sylvia Bernard is now running an experiment in which we change the stimuli once every certain number of sessions. And we just don't have enough data to really do the analysis, but we will soon know. So I don't think we have any data set in which we could complete the analysis during learning, but it's certainly something extremely interesting. What I can tell you is that in the simulations, there we can study learning. And what we see is that the shattering dimensionality starts relatively high, but not at the maximum, and then it goes up and it stays up. Whereas if you have some other measure of dimensionality, for instance, the participation ratio, it's really non-monotonic in many cases. So it goes up initially, and then it goes down toward the end of the process. And that's more or less when the cross-condition generalization performance goes up. It would be great to observe this in the experiments. If you look at different species, again, this is all work in progress, so it's very preliminary, but we certainly see very similar geometry in humans. That's the work that has been done mostly at Caltech. Yuri Minca is the person who did the analysis, and we have a team, Ueli Rutishauser and Ralph Adolphs. They were responsible for collecting the data. And the representations are very similar in many respects. We see multiple variables in an abstract format. In rodents, we also see that is very similar. The only big difference that we observe is in the data of Doris Tsao in the face areas of the monkey, where the cross-condition generalization for some of the important features of the faces is really high, but the shattering dimensionality is low. It's the only place where we actually see a low shattering dimensionality, and we're still trying to understand it, and it's all very preliminary, but that's basically the only big difference that we see.
Great. So we can go on to the next question. I'll also invite this user on screen. I have. Let's see if they would like to come up. Hazem, would you like to come up and ask your question? I've just invited you. Okay, it's taking a while. So we can ask ourselves. I mean, I can just read out. What do performance values for CCGP much smaller than chance equal to 0.2 mean?
Yeah, so that means that you have an arrangement that is very similar to the exclusive OR that I showed you. So that would mean that it anti-cross generalize. And it's something that we see, for instance, in rodents a lot in the experiment that we analyzed. And it actually revealed a very interesting aspect of the encoding of the directional movement of these rodents. Because we were essentially training a decoder to report the directional movement of an animal when it's close to a wall and when it's close to the center of an arena. And in the case the animal was close to the center, it would generalize to other locations right away. So we would have a positive cross-condition generalization, but not when the animal was close to the wall. It was actually anti-generalizing in that case. And then we discovered that the actual abstract variable that is encoded there is whether the wall is on the right or on the left, and not the directional movement, the allocentric directional movement. So that corresponds to typically this kind of geometries.
Great, thanks. So I'll again try to invite the next questioner. Let's see if they can come on. So it's JP Tivierge. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. Yes, we have someone come on. Yes, please go ahead. JP, I don't know your first name. We can't hear you. No, okay. Let's just ask. At least we can see him. So what is the advantage of using multidimensional scaling instead of PCA for dimensionality? Yes.
Oh, there's no advantage. I mean, the reason why we did it was because we wanted to start from the Mala and Obis distances so that we would take into account also the noise. But in the end, if you z-score the data, given that most of the cells have not been recorded simultaneously, you don't really have a particular advantage. So it's just one technique that we picked, and PCA would give you something very similar. We did it, and the representations look very similar.
Okay, great. Thanks. I think this is also done. we have something being, so what is the okay, let me try to invite again. It's not working very well, but we try just to get a bit more faces and a bit more interaction. Sorry, I will need to, I can have only 4 people on screen, so I need to send someone off before I can invite. Okay, so anyway, so what is the justification for assuming a linear decoder in the brain? Yeah, this is something I would also like to ask. And how does discussion change in terms of shattering dimension and abstraction if nonlinear decoders are allowed?
Yeah, no, that's something that people asked since 2013 when we published our first paper that was heavily based on the assumption that linear decoders are important. So I can tell you 2 things. So the first one is that if you want to learn something about the geometry of the representations, you cannot really use an arbitrarily complex decoder. It's more or less the argument of Jim DiCarlo. So, he's studying what happens in the retina, and then, let's say, in infratemporal cortex. And all the information is in the retina. It's already there. It's present. But it's interesting to know whether essentially something as simple as a neuron would be able to classify the stimuli. And the answer is that if you do it on the basis of the representations of the retina, you cannot do it, but you can do it in the infratemporal cortex. And a linear decoder is probably very similar to what a single neuron can do, at least if you have a very simple approximation of what a biological neuron can do. The second consideration I want to make is that we use this approach also in prefrontal cortex when we introduced the first time the shattering dimensionality in our 2013 paper. And in that case, I can tell you that the shattering dimensionality is predicting the behavior of the monkey. But if you use a nonlinear decoder, then you cannot. So the information is all there. You can extract it using a nonlinear decoder, also in the error trials. And it's only if you use a linear decoder that you can actually predict the behavior of the monkey. That indicates that we're not sure that the monkey is using a linear decoder, but it would be compatible with the behavior of the monkey. And that's probably not too surprising because these areas are very close to the final stages of processing. And so you want representations that are linearly separable. And that's why we decided to use a linear decoder.
Right. I'll say thanks on behalf of Henry, and we move on. Again, Sylvia has asked another question. Let me see if I can invite her. Yeah, and in the meanwhile, can you expand on the topic of differences between hippocampus and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex?
Yeah, so, okay, the first thing that we see is that typically the decision is probably made in prefrontal cortex. These are overtrained monkeys, so it's not too surprising. We believe the hippocampus is extremely important in the early stages of learning, and that's one of the things we want to test in the new experiments. But these are overtrained monkeys. They've seen these 2 contexts for a really long time, for several months. And it's always the same stimuli in every session. So as I showed you, the decision of the monkey can be decoded a little earlier in prefrontal cortex than in hippocampus. And I remind you that we have most of the neurons are from the hippocampus, so the difference is not explainable by the different number of neurons. It will go in the opposite direction. The second thing that I can tell you is that the cross-condition generalization performance clearly goes down for context only in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex when the stimuli are presented. So, this could be related to the fact that you want to increase a little bit the dimensionality in the brain area when you want to make the decision, because in order to make the decision in this particular task, you have a non-linearly separable situation, so you need to have the maximal dimensionality. But again, this is purely speculative because we cannot do the analysis in the right interval. The last thing that I can mention is that I didn't have time to present, but when the monkey switches from one context to another, actually when we switch, because the monkey doesn't know that we decided to at some point to change the rule, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex seems to be the only brain area that correlates to behavior in the early trials. And it takes much longer for the hippocampus to switch. The only problem is that we see this very clearly in one monkey and not in the other one. So we will need more experiments to see whether this is a strong effect or not. But my impression is that hippocampus is very important for learning, and it's something we're going to test. But in this experiment, it's pretty much out of the game. I mean, it keeps learning because you never know, things might change, but it's not involved in the decisions of the monkey.
Great. Yeah, and then again, another question by Sylvia, but it's been voted up, so I assume other people are also interested. So yes, and how do you interpret the need of representing the input in the last neural network you showed? I guess they mean where you ensure that it acts like an autoencoder and has to represent the input. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you clearly need to encode these variables when you want to switch, for instance, because you want to know the feedback from the previous trial, because again, there is no contextual cue. So when we change the rules, the monkey has to rely on trial and error behavior and see that if the feedback is that I was expecting reward and I didn't get it, then I need to switch to a different representation. So I need to represent value of the previous trial in an abstract format in order to do that. What we don't know is why it should be represented. It should be represented. The information should be there. But what we don't know is why it should be represented in an abstract format. And if you guys have any idea, then please let me know. And in particular, action of the previous trial is abstracting prefrontal cortex and not in the hippocampus. And that's also something that we don't know how to interpret. Again, action is important to be represented because not only you need the feedback, but you need to know also what you did in the previous trial, because sometimes monkeys make a mistake and we didn't change the rule. So, just the value is not sufficient to say what I need to do next. But we don't know why it should be represented in an abstract format, and we don't know why it's not represented in an abstract format in the hippocampus.
Probably, I don't know if this is my interpretation or something that I would like to ask in continuation with this is also in the reinforcement learning network that you had, you said that you also needed to decode the input from the network. Otherwise, it would not abstract. So why was, any thoughts on why that is required?
Yeah, so these networks tend to be highly optimized, and so they try to represent the minimum that is really sufficient to essentially perform the task. So they do represent these variables, but not in an abstract format unless we introduce this autoencoder. And our suspicion is that this is basically the role of the hippocampus. So this is something that has been proposed by many others, that the hippocampus essentially is a sort of an autoencoder, a sparse autoencoder, that takes whatever comes in the input, so all the complex sensory experiences, and it compresses these representations then to store them more efficiently in the cortex. So we have a model. We have another bioarchive paper where we made this assumption, and we are testing this model also on this data, but we don't have any result at the moment.
Yeah, this also ties in with your earlier statement of the variational autoencoders and essentially trying to represent latent variables, and maybe then the brain is having a generative model of the world, and
yeah, absolutely.
And somehow, that would also help in abstraction.
Yeah, so that's certainly something we want to try, and we want to understand whether in these variational autoencoders, and in particular in the beta variational autoencoders, where you basically encourage the network even more to factorize the representations, you actually get all the same properties of the geometry that we observed in the experiment. And we are not sure because it might be a little too much factorized, but it's something we need to investigate.
Great. Yeah, that's thanks. Yeah, so we are almost, and I'm sorry if this is due. Should we? There are two more, if you wish. These are not particularly upvoted, but we can go over if you still have the
Yeah.
stamina. Okay, yeah. So, how do you expect the representations in different areas to change with a probabilistic version of the task?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we have a sort of a probabilistic task that we are studying with Rusbe Chiani, but we don't really have, we have very preliminary results. We see a very similar geometry, at least for some aspects. For instance, context is represented in an abstract format. And in general, I don't really know what to expect. I guess that probabilities will be encoded in one way or another, and that's probably something that we should see also in the simulations. Whether they are represented in an abstract format or not, that's difficult to say, also because our analysis has been developed for binary variables, and so probabilities that are continuous variables, we don't really know how to deal with them at the moment.
Right, thanks. And then the final question is that possible to pool all the neurons in dorsolateral PFC, anterior cingulate cortex, and hippocampus together to build a biological neural network to compare with the artificial neural network, to characterize the property of the biological neural network of how they do representation?
Yeah, no, then that's something we're planning to do. And actually, we have data that Jérôme Munuera collected also in the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex, same experiment. So we would have 5 different brain areas. And one of the things we're planning is to pull together all these recordings and then try to build a model where we actually have these different brain areas. And we have a few ideas how to do it, but it will take some time.
Okay, so that's done with the questions. I thank Stefano again profusely, and hopefully you can also show your appreciation on the chat box. That's the only way we can applaud. But personally, at least, it has been a great talk. I mean, it's a great breadth of coverage of various different subjects, and also I can see lots of new ideas emerging, and you already are working on a
Thanks
lot.
again for the invitation and for all the very interesting questions and the discussion.
Yeah, no, most useful. And thanks again, and all the best in these times. Ciao.
All right. Bye. Thanks.